before. On Wednesday, June 25th, 1919, after proper notification of Carrington Harris, which did not include surmises as to what we expected to find, my uncle and I conveyed to the Shunned House 2 camp chairs and a folding camp cot, together with some scientific mechanism of greater weight and intricacy. These we placed in the cellar during the day, screening the windows with paper and planning to return in the evening for our first vigil. We had locked the door from the cellar to the ground floor, and having a key to the outside cellar door, we were prepared to leave our expensive and delicate apparatus. Which we had obtained secretly and at great cost, as many days as our vigils might need be protracted. It was our great design to sit up together till very late and then watch singly till dawn, in 2-hour stretches, myself first and then my companion, my inactive member resting on the cot. The natural leadership with which my uncle procured the instruments from the laboratories of Brown University in the Cranston Street Armory, and instinctively assumed direction of our venture, was a marvelous commentary on the potential vitality and resilience of a man of 81. Elihu Whipple had lived accordingly to the hygienic laws which he had preached as a physician, and but for what happened later would only be here in full vigor today. Only 2 persons suspect what did happen: Carrington Harris and myself. I had to tell Harris because he owned the house and deserved to know what had gone out of it. Then, too, we had spoken to him in advance of our quest, and I felt, after my uncle's going, that he would understand and assist me in some vitally necessary public explanations. He had turned very pale, but agreed to help me, and decided it would now be safe to rent the house. To declare that we were not nervous on that rainy night of watching would be an exaggeration both gross and ridiculous. We were not, as I've said, in any sense childishly superstitious, but scientific study and reflection had taught us that the known universe of 3 dimensions embraces the merest fraction of the whole cosmos of substance and energy. In this case, an overwhelming preponderance of evidence from numerous and authentic sources pointed to the tenacious existence of certain forces of great power and, so far as the human point of view is concerned, exceptional malignancy. To say that we actually believed in vampires or werewolves would be a carelessly inclusive statement. Rather, must it be said that we were not prepared to deny the possibility of certain unfamiliar and unclassified modifications of vital force and attenuated matter existing very infrequently in 3-dimensional space because of its more intimate connection with other spatial units, yet close enough to the boundary of our own to furnish us occasional manifestations with which we, for lack of a proper vantage point, may never hope to understand. In short, it seemed to my uncle and me that an incontrovertible array of facts pointed to some lingering influence in the Shunned House, traceable to one or another of the ill-favored French settlers of 2 centuries before, and still operative through rare and unknown laws of atomic and electronic motion. That the family of Roulet had possessed an abnormal affinity for outer circles of entity, dark spheres which normal folk hold only repulsion and terror, the recorded history seems to prove. Had not then the riots of those bygones 1730s set moving certain kinetic patterns in the morbid brain of one or more of them, notably the sinister Paul Roulette, which obscurely survives the bodies murdered and buried by the mob, and continue to function in some multiple dimension space along the original lines of force determined by a frantic hatred of the encroaching community. Such a thing was not a physical or biochemical impossibility in the light of a newer science which includes the theories of relativity and interatomic action. One might easily imagine an alien nucleus of substance or energy, formless, otherwise kept alive by imperceptible or immaterial subtractions from the life force. Or bodily tissues or fluids or other more probably living things into which it penetrates and with whose fabric it sometimes completely immerses itself. It might be actively hostile, or it might be dictated merely by blind motives of self-preservation. In any case, such a monster must of necessity be in our scheme of things an anomaly and an intruder, whose extirpation forms a primary duty with every man not an enemy to the world's life, health, and sanity. What baffled us was our utter ignorance of the aspect in which we might encounter the thing. No sane person had ever seen it, and few had ever felt it definitely. It might be pure energy, a form ethereal and outside of the realm of the substance, or it might be partly material, some unknown and equivocal mass of plasticity, capable of changing at will to nebulous approximations of the solid, liquid, gaseous, or tenuously unparticled states. The anthropomorphic patch of mold on the floor, the form of yellowish vapor, and the curvature of the tree roots in some of the old tales, all argued at least a remote and reminiscent connection with the human shape. But how representative or permanent that similarity might be, none could say with any kind of certainty. We had devised two weapons to fight it, a large and specially fitted Crookes tube, operated by powerful storage batteries and provided with peculiar screens and reflectors, in case it proved intangible and opposable only by vigorously destructive ether radiations. And a pair of military flamethrowers of the sort used in the World War, in case it proved partly material and susceptible of mechanical destruction. For like the superstitious Exeter rustics, we were prepared to burn the thing's heart out if its heart existed to burn. All this aggressive mechanism was we sat in the cellar in positions carefully arranged with reference to the cot and chairs, and to the spot before the fireplace where the mold had taken strange shapes. That suggestive patch, by the way, was only faintly visible when we placed our furniture and instruments, and when we returned that evening for the actual vigil. For a moment, I half doubted I had ever seen it in more definitely limbed form, but then I thought of the legends. Our cellar vigil began at 10 p.m. daylight savings time, and as it continued, we found no promise of pertinent developments. A weak, filtered glow from the rain-harassed street lamps outside, and a feeble phosphorescence from the detestable fungi within, showed the dipping stones of the walls, from which all the trace of whitewash had vanished. The dank, footed, and mildew-tainted hard earth floor with its obscene fungi. The rotting remains of what had been stools, chairs, and tables, and other more shapeless furniture. The heavy planks and massive beams of the ground floor overhead, the decrepit plank door leading to bins and chambers beneath the other parts of the house, the crumbling stone staircase with its ruined wood handrail, and the crude and cavernous fireplace of blackened brick where rusted iron fragments revealed the past presence of hooks, andirons, spit, crane, and a door to the Dutch oven. These things and our austere cot and camp chairs and the heavy and intricate destructive machinery we had brought. We had, as in all my other former explorations, left the door to the street unlocked so that a direct and practical path of escape might lie open in case of manifestations beyond our power to deal with. It was our idea that our continued nocturnal presence would call forth whatever malign entity lurked there, and that being prepared, we could dispose of the thing with one or two or more or other of our provided means as soon as we recognized and observed it sufficiently. How long it might require to evoke and extinguish the thing, we had no notion. It occurred to us that, too, that our venture was far from safe, for in what strength the thing might appear, no one could tell. But we deemed the game worth the hazard and embarked on it alone and unhesitatingly, conscious that the seeking of outside aid would only expose us to ridicule and perhaps defeat our entire purpose. Such was our frame of mind as we talked far into the night, till my uncle's growing drowsiness made me remind him to lie down for his 2 hours' sleep. Something like fear chilled me as I sat there in the small hours alone. I say alone, for one who sits by a sleeper is indeed alone, perhaps more alone than he can realize. My uncle breathed heavily, his deep inhalations and exhalations, accompanied by the rain outside, and punctuated by another nerve-wracking sound of distant, dripping water within. For the house was repulsively damp even in dry weather, and in this storm positively swamp-like. I studied the loose, antique masonry of the walls and the fungus light and feeble rays which stole in from the street through the screen windows, and once, when the noisome atmosphere of the place seemed about to sicken me, I opened the door and looked up and down the street. Feasting my eyes on familiar sights and my nostrils on the wholesome air, still nothing occurred to reward my watching, and I yawned repeatedly, fatigue getting the better of my apprehension. Then the stirring of my uncle in his sleep attracted my notice. He had turned restlessly on the cot several times during the latter half of the first hour, but now he was breathing with unusual regularity, occasionally heaving a sigh which held more than a few of the qualities of a choking moan. I turned my electric flashlight on him and found his face averted. So rising and crossing to the other side of the cot, I again flashed the light to see if he seemed in any pain. What I saw unnerved me most surprisingly, considering its relative triviality. It must have been merely the association of an odd circumstance with the sinister nature of our location and mission, for surely the circumstance was not in itself frightful or unnatural. It was merely that my uncle's facial expression, disturbed no doubt by the strange dreams which our situation prompted, betrayed considerable agitation and seemed not at all characteristic of him. His habitual expression was one kindly and well-bred calm, whereas now and a variety of emotions seemed struggling within him. I think on the whole it was this variety which chiefly disturbed me. My uncle, as he gasped and tossed in increasing perturbation, and with eyes that had now started open, it seemed not one but many men, and suggested a curious quality of alienage from himself. All at once he commenced to mutter, and I did not like the look of his mouth and teeth as he spoke. The words were at first indistinguishable, and then, with a tremendous start, I recognized something about them which filled me with icy fears until I recalled the breadth of my uncle's education and the interminable translations he had made from the anthropological antiquarian articles in the Revue des Deux Mondes. For the venerable Elihu Whipple was muttering in French, and the few phrases I could distinguish seemed connected with the darkest myths he had ever adapted from the famous Paris magazine. Suddenly a perspiration broke out on the sleeper's head, and he leapt abruptly awake, half awake. The jumble of French changed into a cry in English, and the hoarse voice shouted excitedly, "My breath! My breath!" Then the awakening became complete, and with the substance of facial expressions in normal state, my uncle seized my hand and began to relate a dream whose nucleus of significance I could only surmise with a kind of awe. He had, he said, floated off in a very ordinary series of dream pictures into a scene whose strangeness was related to nothing he had ever read. It was of this world, and yet not of it. A shadowy geometrical confusion in which could be seen elements of familiar things in most unfamiliar and perturbing combinations. There was a suggestion of queerly disordered pictures, superimposed one upon another, an arrangement in which the essentials of time as well as space seemed dissolved and mixed in the most illogical fashion. In this kaleidoscopic vortex of phantasmal images were occasional snapshots, if one might use the term, of singular clearness but unaccountable heterogeneity. Once my uncle thought he laid in a carelessly dug open pit, with a crowd of angry faces he framed by straggling blocks, and three-cornered hats frowning down on him. Again he seemed to be in an interior of a house. An old house, apparently, but the details and inhabitants were constantly changing, and he could never be certain of the faces or the furniture, or even the room itself, since the doors and windows seemed in just as great a state of flux as the more presumably mobile objects. It was queer, damnably queer, and my uncle spoke almost sheepishly, as if half expecting not to believe. He believed, when he declared that of the strange faces many had unmistakably borne the features of the Harris family. And all the while there was a personal sensation of choking, as if some pervasive presence had spread itself through its body and sought to possess itself of its vital processes. I shuddered at the thought of those vital processes, worn as they were by 81 years of continuous functioning, in conflict with unknown forces of which the youngest and strongest system might well be afraid, but in another moment reflected that dreams are only dreams, and that these uncomfortable visions could be, at most, no more than my uncle's reaction to the investigations and expectations which had lately filled our minds to the exclusion of all else. Conversation also soon tended to dispel my sense of strangeness. In a time I yielded to my yawns and took my turn at slumber. My uncle seemed now very wakeful and welcomed his period of watching, even though the nightmare had roused him so far as of his allotted 2 hours. Sleep seized me quickly, and I was at once haunted with dreams of the most disturbing kind. I felt in my visions a cosmic and abysmal loneliness, with hostility surging from all sides, upon some prison where I lay confined. I seemed bound and gagged and taunted by echoing yells of distant multitudes who thirst for my blood. My uncle's face came to me with less pleasant associations than in waking hours, and I recall many futile struggles and attempts to scream. It was not a pleasant sleep, and for a second I was not sorry for the echoing shriek which clove through the barriers of dream and flung me to a sharp and startled wakefulness in which every actual object before my eyes stood out with more than natural clearness and reality.